To say that Sarah was different after the incident with the Rottweiler would be a gross understatement. The darkness in her eyes that visited from time to time had taken up residency, only leaving for brief moments to remind us that our little girl still existed. We took her to several therapists, hoping that perhaps with professional help she could overcome whatever demons she was battling inside her, and that we'd finally get our little girl back. What we got in return were conflicting diagnoses: psychosis, bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD, schizophrenia to name a few, and a constant wave of referrals. Sarah would barely get 2 or 3 appointments out of the same therapist before being recommended to another, more qualified practitioner. Some would even just stop showing up altogether and refuse to return our phone calls. After a couple of years of this, Hannah and I ultimately decided to forego therapy and focus on learning what we could on the subject ourselves. The constant loss of people in her life was doing far more harm than good. Given the juggling act of therapists, quests for her to change teachers in school mid-year, and the lack of friends, I can't say I was surprised to see Sarah shut down, and it broke my heart. The bullying tapered off for a while after the demise of Bear, but children are quick to forget, and it wasn't long before the abuse from the other children started up again, and with a ferocity that both terrified and infuriated us. Hannah and I did everything we could think of to protect Sarah from the barrage of hate, and to protect the other children from suffering unimaginable consequences. We practiced breathing exercises. We taught Sarah how to get help from adults, specifically adults who were required to intervene, and how to get herself away from these situations. Always vigilant, Anna and I would drop Sarah off at school, or take walks around the neighbourhood to see other children in casts, braces and crutches, and we would always wonder how many of them had been genuine accidents, and how many had pushed Sarah too far. There certainly seemed to be more injuries than seemed normal. It was foolish to assume Sarah hadn't played a part in at least a few of them, no matter how often we practiced self-control with her. Of course, we couldn't ask Sarah about it. We couldn't even think about it around her. We told ourselves it was because we wanted to avoid isolating Sarah more than she already was, which was absolutely true. But the whole truth was that we were also afraid of her turning on us. She seemed so volatile that a wrong word, a wrong thought, could push her over the edge. For better or worse, we didn't have to bring it up because her involvement in the mysterious neighbourhood injuries was all but confirmed over the course of a few months, when the 3 boys from down the street, Austin, Preston and Kenny, all managed to find themselves in casts with broken bones and were suddenly too busy to care much about picking on our daughter. If I'm being honest with myself, I was glad to see those boys laid up for a bit. Sarah's wrath had been a long time coming, and if I could have gotten away with smacking those boys around a bit, I probably would have. After some time passed, Hannah and I noticed that one of the 3 boys was missing. Although Kenny and Preston still came around on occasion to throw rocks at the house or yell profanities at Sarah as she sat outside, Austin was nowhere to be seen. Fearing the worst, we started asking around the neighbourhood about the boy. Neither Hannah nor myself had a good rapport with Austin's parents. I'd nearly come to blows with his father over the incident with his dog, so walking down the street and knocking on the door wasn't really an option. Fortunately, Hannah was able to gather that the Francis family had moved a few weeks prior from the woman who lived next door. Nobody knew why they'd moved, but nobody really had a great relationship with that family. Randall Francis was an alcoholic, and Lorraine Francis was a chain-smoking drug addict. Nobody in the neighbourhood was sorry to see their house vacant. About a year after, the Ryan family moved as well, leaving Preston Jarvis alone to pick on Sarah. Having now lost his 2 best friends to cross-country relocations, Preston's own isolation made him even meaner and more cruel towards Sarah. Perhaps if his friends had been around, things would have gone differently for Preston, although that was far out of his control. The Preston Jarvis incident, as it would forever be branded in my mind, occurred on July 4th, 2019. The 3 of us had spent the morning with the rest of the town on Main Street for the annual Independence Day parade. Sarah hadn't wanted to go, but had been a good sport about it at least. These days, she kept almost entirely to herself, only really coming out of her room for meals and to go to school. Every free moment she had was spent with her nose in a book enjoying the escape to distant lands where children were nice to each other and villains got their comeuppance. Hannah and I encouraged this as much as we could, while also trying to promote social growth, which was as difficult as it was terrifying, but also equally as necessary. Sarah had brought along a novel called New Moon, the second book in her favourite series that she'd finished several times already, and together we enjoyed the sun and the food and the sights offered by the parade. We'd gotten a few smiles out of her, a rare occurrence these days, so Hannah and I were taking the day as a win. That was until Preston Jarvis rolled up on his bike. He'd been bold to bully Sarah in front of us before, but today he must have been feeling especially brave. "Hey there, freak," he called from the curb. "Why don't they put you in a cage and parade you around this year?" "Get the fuck out of here," I retorted. "Oh, fuck off, old man," Preston said angstfully. "It's your fault she's such a freak anyway. Your whole family's probably a bunch of devil worshippers. That's what my dad says. I think we'd all be better off if you were all dead." I stood from the camping chair we'd brought with us and walked the few feet that stood between us. "Listen here, you little shit," I said between my teeth. "I don't give a fuck what you or your dad thinks. Come around my family again, and I'll put you in the hospital." He looked at me for a beat, then opened his mouth to reply. His eyes shifted then to Sarah, and his expression turned to a mixture of fear and hatred. Then his mouth closed, and he rode off down the street. I sat back down, expecting to be chastised by Hannah for threatening a kid, but got nothing other than a sideways look. "You all right, kiddo?" I asked Sarah. I couldn't be sure from where I sat, but I thought I could see the shadow of a smile on her lips. "Yeah," she answered. "I think it'd be better if he were dead." Hannah and I exchanged a look of concern. "I don't think so," Hannah said, always the mitigator. "I think his family would miss him. We may not like him, but there's plenty of people that do, and they would be sad if something happened." Sarah nodded in response, more of an acknowledgement than agreement, and went back to her book. Later that day, we found ourselves at the park to enjoy the firework display the city put on. We'd enjoyed it as much as we could from the crowds during the parade, so that night we hung back quite a bit from where the main groups were. Hannah and I sat on a park bench enjoying hot dogs, while Sarah sat under a tree and worked on finishing her book before the sun started setting. Just as I swallowed the last bit of hot dog, I heard a hissing sound and felt the rush of warm air on my cheek. Bang! A bottle rocket exploded near the tree where Sarah sat. I whipped around and was unsurprised to see Preston Jarvis 10 feet away, aiming another bottle rocket at us. He lit the rocket, and moments later it flew past me, hitting the tree Sarah sat against and exploding. I stood up, and Preston knew he only had a few seconds before I knocked him to the ground. He bent over and picked out the largest from the pile of fireworks at his feet. It was significantly larger than the ones he'd shot at us, and lit the fuse. Before I could get close enough to stop him, the firework went off. It fired several shots, one after the other, turning our small patch of park into the scene from a war movie. I turned my back and felt the hot rockets hit me and shower me with ash and spent gunpowder. I looked up and saw that several of the fireworks had hit their target. Sarah was wiping embers off her face and out of her hair while her book smouldered at her feet. After the fireworks were spent, smoke and the scent of sulphur hung in the air like fog. I turned around to face Preston. The rage I felt must not have been the fraction of rage Sarah was feeling, because I didn't get a step towards the boy before every firework at his feet exploded. He stumbled backwards and cried out in surprise and pain. Then a dark spot began to grow at the crotch of his pants, and his eyes widened to a look of sheer terror. He stood up and began to run, screaming in horror and calling for help. A second later, Sarah rushed past me after the boy. I lunged forward, hoping to catch one of Sarah's hands, but she was too quick. The sun had set by now, and the park was growing dark quickly as I bolted after the children. Preston's legs and arms pumped wildly as he ran past trees and bushes, desperately trying to escape his pursuer. He turned and ran into the thicker part of the trees, with Sarah hot on his heels. I beelined towards them, calling Sarah's name and begging her to not do anything to Preston. I saw their shapes passing the trees. Preston then Sarah. Preston then Sarah. Then it was just Sarah. "No!" I cried desperately. "No, Sarah! No!" Sarah stopped and I manoeuvred around the trees as quickly as I could, praying that I would find anything other than that boy's body at her feet. I was both relieved and terrified when I found Sarah alone. "Sarah, where's Preston?" I asked between hard breaths. "Where did he go?" "Nowhere," Sarah said. I looked around at the ground, up in the trees, in the bushes, and there was no sign of the boy. "Sarah," I said sharply, "what happened?" She didn't answer. I grabbed her shoulders, trying not to panic, but slowly losing the battle. "Sarah!" I yelled, shaking her. "Sarah, what did you do?" Hannah caught up to us by now and gently removed my hands from Sarah's shoulders. "What happened?" she asked. I could tell she was trying as hard as I was to keep her voice steady. "Where's Preston?" Sarah still said nothing. The glassy, dead look in her eyes remained, unwavering. I looked down then and saw the boy's footprints in the dirt. In the quickly dwindling light, it was difficult to make them out from Sarah's and my own, but with the flashlight on my phone, I was able to track the boy's final steps. He'd run past the tree that I'd seen him behind, then turned, and then his footprints stopped in the middle of the path. They didn't lead to a tree or a bush. They simply just stopped. I searched for hours and found no other clue to Preston's whereabouts. Hannah took Sarah home and put her to bed. She still hadn't said a word about what had happened. Nor would she ever. When I'd exhausted my search of the area, I had Hannah pick me up. We drove home in silence, neither of us sure what to say, but both feeling unspeakably terrified. I waited anxiously for the phone call from the police, for the news reports about the missing child, for the Amber Alert on my phone. But nothing came. There were no newspaper articles, no breaking news, no missing child posters. Absolutely nothing. 2 weeks went by before I got the courage to ask Preston's father about him. We hadn't ever been on good terms, but he had been washing his car while I was out for my morning jog, and I didn't think another opportunity would present itself in the near future. "Hey, Mark," I called from the street.
"Hey,"
he called back pleasantly, which somewhat surprised me.
"How's it going?"
"Not bad," I said. "I haven't seen Preston in a while. Is he at summer camp or something?"
"Who?"
Mark Jarvis asked. My heart had been pounding furiously in my chest from the anticipation of speaking with Preston's father, but now it seemed to stop completely. "What?" I asked breathlessly.
"Who are you talking about?"
Mark wore an expression of confusion, as if I'd just grown a second head. "Preston," I repeated. "Your son, about Sarah's age." The corners of his mouth turned down slightly, and he raised an eyebrow.
"I don't have a son," he said. "You feeling all right?"
I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. Yeah, I managed to get out. "Sorry, I think I might have a little heat stroke, I guess."
"You better get inside then,"
he said, his expression now turning from confusion to genuine concern.
"Looks like it might be serious. Do you want me to walk up the street with you?"
"No thanks," I told him. "I'll head back home now." He waved goodbye as I walked away, my morning cardio routine completely forgotten. Later that night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, I would tell Hannah about what had happened. She would look as confused as I'd felt for a moment. Then, after taking the time to fully process what had happened, she would begin to sob. We had thought that Sarah killed Preston Jarvis, but the reality was much worse. She had completely erased him from existence.